Welcome, everybody. I'm Abraham Newman, and I am the director of the Mortara Center here at Georgetown University. And I am delighted to co-host with the Asian Studies program at Georgetown this book talk for Kristen Looney to celebrate and also to introduce to our community the work that she's just published, Mobilizing for Development, the Modernization of Rural East Asia. And as you may or may not know, one of the things that the Mortara Center loves to do is to promote and support faculty and student research. And there's nothing better that we like to do, and that is to celebrate great accomplishments of our faculty. So without further ado, I want to first introduce Professor Looney, and then Professor Green, who will be giving comments on Professor Looney's book, and then we'll have a wide-ranging discussion on the research topics. So I'm already seeing Kristen just smile from ear to ear, which is how you should feel when you've just finished your book and it's out into the world. So congratulations. Professor Looney is an assistant professor of Asian Studies and Government at Georgetown University, where she teaches courses on China and comparative politics. This is her first book from Cornell University Press, and we're excited to hear more about it. Professor Mike Green is the director of the Asian Studies program and is also chair in modern and contemporary Japanese politics and foreign policy at the School of Foreign Service. He will be providing initial comments and questions to Professor Looney to kick off our discussion. And so without further ado, I turn it over to Professor Looney.
Okay, thank you. Awesome that this many people would turn out for my book talk. Thank you. Thank you, Abe, for the introduction. Thank you, Mike, for agreeing to moderate this event. Thank you to my students and friends and colleagues who all showed up for this. If there ever was a time to say, please buy my book, I think it's right now. So please buy my book. I just really appreciate everybody's support. So I'm going to share my screen and give a PowerPoint presentation, and I will be talking for about 30 minutes to just introduce you to the main problems the book addresses and the main arguments. And then I'm happy to answer any questions that you all might have at the end of my time. Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen. Hopefully there will be no technical difficulties. Let me go ahead and do that. Okay. Are we good? Can people see it? Yeah, okay. All right, so my book is titled Mobilizing for Development, the Modernization of Rural East Asia. And today's talk, I've organized it as follows. Let's see here. First, I'm gonna go over the problem. Next, I'll talk about the argument and how we can understand variation in East Asia. And then finally, I'm just gonna conclude with some thoughts about the East Asian model. So let's begin with the problem and a definition. What is rural development? I define rural development as improvements in agricultural production, rural living standards, and the village environment. To give you some specific measures, I'm talking about agricultural growth rates, crop yields, household incomes, and then by village environment, I mean village infrastructure, sanitation, and even housing. The book addresses two main questions about rural development. First, why has East Asia achieved better rural development outcomes than other regions? And second, why have some East Asian countries performed better than others in terms of rural development? So the first question deals with the relative success of East Asia, and the second question deals with variation in the East Asian region. It's worth reflecting just for a minute about the significance of rural development. If you're not from the countryside, you've probably spent very little of your life thinking about farming. But when you think about global poverty, it's important to note that it's predominantly a rural phenomenon. According to the World Bank, 78% of the world's poor, or about 800 million people, live in rural areas and depend on agriculture for their livelihood. The majority of people suffering from hunger are also small farmers in the developing world. And in many countries, agriculture still accounts for a significant portion of GDP and employment. So rural development therefore matters greatly for poverty reduction, for food security, and for economic growth. Yet governments routinely fail their rural citizens. Urban bias has been described by these authors, Michael Lipton and Robert Bates, as the belief in the superiority of agriculture over industry and cities over villages as the engines of growth and modernization. And this belief, held by many political elites in developing countries, translates into a policy environment that systematically discriminates against agriculture, as seen in price, trade, and investment policies that favor the urban industrial sector. Because of urban bias, it's important to understand that rural development does not necessarily go along with industrial development. In other words, it's possible to have urban industrial growth occurring alongside rural stagnation and poverty. Now, it's true we don't think of East Asia as rural anymore. Quite the opposite. We think of East Asia, or Northeast Asia more specifically, as home to the world's most dynamic megacities. But of course, if we go back in time to the immediate post-World War II period, before industrialization in the region took off, most people were actually living as poor farmers. In 1949, Wolf Ledyczynski, who previously was an agriculture expert working for the US Department of Agriculture and for the World Bank, he made the following observation about conditions in Taiwan. He wrote, "Of all the farmyards I have seen in the Far East, Southeast Asia, and in the Middle East, that of the average Taiwanese tenant is among the worst, both in appearance and in equipment. Tenants' huts, so-called barnyards, equipment, and livestock, as well as their health, point to nothing but poverty." Now, Taiwan remained mostly rural for the next 2 decades, for the 50s and the 60s. By the 1970s, however, the relative decline of agriculture had become apparent, and that was also true for the region as a whole. So as you can see here, East Asia, which is represented by the blue line at the bottom of the graph, agriculture's GDP steadily declined over time. And this graph shows the declining share of the rural population in the total population by region. And you can see East Asia also declining with the blue line. Now, agriculture's decline is even more obvious if you look at the individual country level. So here we have agriculture's contribution to GDP in 1953 versus 2010 for Taiwan, South Korea, and China. And you can see it's still quite minuscule. It exists, but in Taiwan and Korea, agriculture's contribution is quite minuscule. The drop in the importance of the agricultural sector is also evident in terms of labor. Now in China, still over 30% of the labor force is in agriculture, but the employment structure has shifted. Now, despite the relative decline of agriculture, East Asia has actually been much more successful than other regions in the world at achieving very high levels of production, as seen here with comparative data on cereal yields. So at this point, hopefully you're wondering why. Why, despite the relative decline of agriculture, was East Asia better able to achieve these outcomes than other places? So that gets back to this first question I'm asking about the relative success of East Asia. In addition, hopefully you're wondering who benefited from these gains. Was it the state? Was it the urban industrial sector? Or was it farmers themselves? And what about other aspects of development besides production? Finally, how did the region deal with the problem of agricultural adjustment, meaning the declining performance and the declining size of the rural sector as the industrialization process deepened? So those were some of the key questions that motivated my research. And what I found is that if we take a look across the region, it becomes pretty obvious that there was a lot of variation. And what I mean by that is that different types of outcomes, production, living standards in the village environment, were achieved at different times, to different degrees, and in different ways. And previous studies of the region have not, in my view, adequately dealt with that question of variation in East Asia. And also what you find, if you look carefully at rural policy, is this very curious change that happens at the later stages of industrialization, where East Asian governments move away from urban bias and reverse course. They try intentionally to stimulate rural development, but not actually in the way that you might think of. So instead of just removing market distortions or giving subsidy packages to farmers, what they did was they launched enormous mass mobilization campaigns in the countryside to achieve breakthroughs in rural development. So that brings me to the argument of the book. So the main argument can be summarized as follows. First, during the early stages of industrialization, certain institutions facilitated growth in agricultural production. In Taiwan and South Korea and Japan as well, those institutions included smallholder farming systems with secure private property rights to land, technocratic bureaucracies, and encompassing farmers' organizations, encompassing in the sense that almost the entire rural population belonged to those organizations. And in China as well, after rural reform started in the early 1980s, there was a kind of institutional convergence between China and its East Asian neighbors. There were some differences, obviously, too, but there was some broad similarities. There were some broad similarities. Now, the second part of the argument is that progress in other areas besides production was undercut by urban bias. There are different measures for urban bias. You can look at the nominal and relative rates of assistance for agriculture, which basically measures the government support for farm products versus non-farm products. You can also look at the import of surplus food in order to drive down domestic prices. And then, of course, the share of government investment that went to the rural sector as compared to the industrial sector. And by all of those measures, East Asia discriminated against agriculture for at least the first 2 decades of industrialization. Now, during the later stages of industrialization, campaigns led to further gains in rural living standards and the village environment. I define rural modernization campaigns as policies that demand very high levels of bureaucratic and popular mobilization to overhaul traditional ways of life in the countryside. And the last thing I want to note is that variation in the region may be explained by what I call the interplay between campaigns and institutions. And on that point, I just want to elaborate a little bit by what I mean, what I mean by interplay. So the first thing that I mean is that institutions and campaigns matter for different types of outcomes. So institutions, including farmers' organizations, matter for the development and promotion of scientific agriculture, whereas campaigns are very successful at achieving basic construction projects, but not so much at achieving things that require inputs. Another point, quality of rural institutions affects campaign outcomes quite dramatically. And the rural institutions that I'm most concerned about are local governments and farmers' organizations. Local governments and farmers' organizations are important because they provide checks on implementing officials from above and below. And without those checks, without rural participation through farmers' organizations, or without local officials who are responsive to rural interests, then campaigns can really spiral out of control. Okay, so what about alternative theories? What is this argument arguing against? There are at least 3 types of explanations that deserve mentioning, and I'll go through these kind of quickly. I don't want to spend too much time because I know a lot of people on here haven't read all this literature. The first is initial conditions. According to these scholars, East Asia inherited favorable initial conditions for rural development after World War II. So in Korea and Taiwan, Japanese colonial authorities invested in rural institutions and infrastructure before the war, which quickly aided agriculture's recovery after the war. China under Mao as well also saw increased state penetration of the countryside, and during the late Maoist period, the spread of technologies and irrigation infrastructure. So that's the initial conditions argument. The next argument is land reform. This is another alternative theory that has received a lot of scholarly attention over the years, in part because the US backed many of these land reforms in East Asia. So the argument goes that US-backed land reforms in the region led to the elimination of large landowners, and it turned the vast majority of tenant farmers into owners of their land. And this had the effect of really stabilizing the countryside politically. And what I mean by that is it eliminated the threat of communism in the Korean, Taiwanese, and Japanese cases. It also improved the distribution of rural income and led to some at least short-term gains in agricultural production. Now, with regards to China, the argument goes that decollectivization, or the breaking down of collective farms in the early 1980s, had a similar impact on the rural economy in terms of stimulating short-term production. And the last argument that people on the call today may be most familiar with is the rise of developmental states. So according to these scholars, East Asia benefited from the presence of technocratic bureaucracies, and with that, a technical, rational approach to policymaking. So by technocratic bureaucracy, I mean simply merit-based bureaucracies in which officials are relatively educated. The region also had lower levels of urban bias than other places. And because of the high rural population density in East Asia, these economies benefited from having a very large pool of surplus labor. Some of you may have heard of the Lewis model, made famous by W. Arthur Lewis in 1954. And he wrote famously that the reallocation of surplus labor from the countryside to the city, or from agriculture to industry, fuels industrial growth, because having a surplus labor supply keeps wages low. And it's that transfer of surplus labor to the cities and to industry that eventually leads to a more efficient and balanced economy. So I'm going to spare you from a lengthy critique of all of those. I could give it, but I'm not going to do it. Instead, I'm just going to say that in general, these theories focus too much on the positive, when in reality, the legacies of colonialism, Maoism, land reform, and developmental states were quite mixed. They also tend to ignore variation in the region. They assume that because gains in production were strong, so too were gains in other areas. Another problem is that these theories have very little to say about differences across countries, and they exclude China from the comparative analysis. Finally, they make some incorrect assumptions about how developmental states operate, and most importantly, they dismiss campaigns. And campaigns, I argue in the book, is a mode or approach to politics that's very different from a technical, rational approach associated with the developmental state. So the book, therefore, attempts to qualify existing theories of East Asian rural development and develop new theory to explain variation among these countries. So in terms of case selection, these are the three main cases. The study covers Taiwan, South Korea, and China. The decades here listed under time period were selected because they represent the most important decades for both industrialization and rural development. I should also note that the 1970s in Taiwan and South Korea and the 2000s in China are significant because they mark the beginning of agricultural adjustment. And what I mean by that term is the moment when the government moved away from urban bias and rural extraction and instead adopted pro-rural development policies. I treat all these cases as successful examples of rural development, but to varying degrees, with Taiwan being the most successful, South Korea less successful, and China the least successful of the three. So certainly with any comparative project, there are variables that can't be controlled, but I should point out that there's some surprising and strong similarities among the three cases as well. They are, at the time of the study at least, all authoritarian regimes. They've all been characterized as developmental states. And the resemblances in rural policy are quite striking, in part because they look to one another's experiences with rural policy when formulating their own policies. There are significant differences as well, including colonial legacies, the nature of US assistance to these countries, and the scale of the state, the scale and size, with China obviously being this huge country that's the size of a continent, and Taiwan and Korea being significantly smaller. And I do try to address those differences in the book. I also do include Japan in the theoretical chapter of the book, but I treat it as an illustrative case, meaning that I use this case to demonstrate the plausibility or the preliminary evidence for the argument before I apply the argument more rigorously to the other cases. I did not include it as a fully developed case only because its rural development process started at least a full century before the other cases, so comparing it would have really made things more complicated. So the book methodologically is a qualitative study. It falls within the tradition of comparative historical analysis, and more specifically, I do a structured comparison of these three cases as well as within case analysis. So looking for evidence within the country at the local level to support my claims. And the research is based on 2+ years in Taiwan, South Korea, and China, numerous archival and library materials. And because the Chinese case was more contemporary, I spent significant time in the Chinese countryside interviewing local officials and villagers for this book. Okay, so just to remind you of the main argument, during the early stages of industrialization, certain institutions facilitated growth and production. Progress in other areas was undercut by urban bias. Then at the later stages of industrialization, campaigns led to further gains in rural living standards in the village environment. And then finally, variation in the region may be explained by the interplay between campaigns and institutions. Okay, So those are campaigns and institutions. These two things highlighted in blue are, so to speak, the independent variables or the explanatory variables, to use political science lingo. And analyzing the effects of institutions and campaigns on rural development, I came up with the following hypotheses. So for starters, in looking at farmers' organizations, I just want to provide you a definition. In East Asia, farmers' organizations are quasi-governmental, corporatist organizations that provide services to rural communities. And in terms of their contribution to rural development, they transfer resources in and out of the rural sector. They provide agricultural extension and technology services. They assist governments with policy implementation. And then finally, they also represent, they act as interest groups on behalf of farmers. Examples include the Farmers Association of Taiwan, the National Agricultural Farmers Association of South Korea, and then the Farmers Professional Cooperatives of China. The main contention that I make about farmers' organizations is that successful rural development is conditional on the strength of farmers' organizations. Now, whether they are strong or weak depends on two things, what I call linkage and autonomy. So bear with me with all this text. I'll just go through this quickly. These are the core hypotheses that I lay out about farmers' organizations. With regards to linkage, farmers' organizations are more likely to benefit small farmers if they have an extensive membership base with strong ties to the village community and are formally linked to higher levels of the state that control key developmental resources. It's important that they're linked to higher levels of the state because I found that local governments cannot be assumed to be more responsive to rural interests. Urban bias is often just as present, if not more present, at the local level than it is at the central level. And then in terms of autonomy, farmers' organizations are more likely to be developmental as opposed to extractive agents of the state and big business if their leaders are actual farmers, selected by farmer members, and if they have financial and managerial independence from the state, giving them a certain degree of voice, political power, and influence over policy. So these are the main arguments that I make about farmers' organizations. And before showing you how these hypotheses map onto the cases, I just want to go through the other main independent variable of the study, which is so as before, modernization campaigns are policies that demand high levels of bureaucratic and popular mobilization to overhaul traditional ways of life in the countryside. In terms of their contribution to rural development, they can galvanize and direct the country's resources towards certain ends. They can overcome local resistance and bureaucratic inertia. They can reduce the central cost or the cost of central policy implementation, and they can really speed up the pace of change, much more so than market forces. Examples that I focus on in the book are the rural community development campaign of Taiwan in the 1970s, the New Village movement or the Saemal Indong of the 1970s in South Korea. And I want to give a shout out to my student Sojong, who's on the call. She has a Saemal movement background. You all can look at that a little bit later. I think it's awesome. And then in China, building a new socialist countryside, which was the campaign that I looked at. It occurred in the 2000s in China. The main contention I make about campaigns is that successful rural development is conditional on the political institutional context in which campaigns take place. And here's again, a brace for more text. I apologize at how wordy this is, but this is the main argument I make about campaigns. Rural modernization campaigns are more likely to work, that is, produce policy compliance and positive outcomes when the state's goal is rural development rather than extraction, when the central government can control local authorities, and when the campaign is carried out in partnership with rural citizens. In other words, to state it more simply, in order for campaigns to work, you have to have developmental goals, bureaucratic controls, and also high levels of rural participation. So here's how the argument kind of maps onto the cases. So I find that Taiwan had the most successful record of rural development because its farmers organizations, the Taiwan Farmers Association, possessed both linkage and autonomy. Moreover, the community development campaign had very clear developmental goals. There were strong central controls over local officials and high levels of rural participation, not just through the FAs, the Taiwan Farmers Association, but also through these campaign organizations called community development councils. And this campaign led to gains in production, increases in incomes, and also a very positive transformation of the village environment with improved infrastructure, sanitation, and housing. Now in South Korea, this case, I argue, was less successful, in part because the National Agricultural Cooperative Federation, the NACF, it possessed linkage. It was linked to higher levels of the state, but not as strongly as Taiwan. And it didn't have any autonomy from the state. It didn't function as a farmer-controlled organization. Instead, it was really an appendage of the authoritarian state. And related to that, the New Village movement, I found, was not as participatory. Other problems with the New Village movement are that, well, it did have developmental goals and there were strong central controls. And so in that way, it was similar to the community development campaign. And it did achieve many positive outcomes in terms of its effect on the village environment. But to give you just one example of failure, the campaign really used compulsory tactics to spread a new high yield variety of rice called tongyil, or unification is how that translates. And that high yield variety of rice ultimately resulted in very serious crop failures and put many people's livelihoods in jeopardy. Farmers resisted it from the beginning, but they were pretty powerless to stop it because they were steamrolled by the NACF. And I concluded after studying these two organizations in comparison that that kind of situation just never would have happened in Taiwan because of how much more participatory the organization was. And then finally for China, I found that the farmers' professional cooperatives, which were only legally sanctioned in 2006, so these are relatively new organizations, they possess neither linkage nor autonomy. And they were treated by the state as a campaign target, right? The goal of the campaign was to establish these things. And in contrast, they were not treated as partners in campaign implementation. For the new socialist countryside, it did have developmental goals, but the goals were also somewhat vague. Some local officials interpreted this campaign as an effort to increase and speed up the pace of urbanization rather than promote rural development as an end in itself. Central control was also lacking because of the kind of huge bureaucratic distance between higher level authorities and local authorities in China, just given the scale of the state. And then finally, rural participation was really lacking. Officials in many places didn't even attempt to include Chinese farmers in the policy process, in the policy implementation process. And I studied these organizations called peasant councils, which were supposed to be quite participatory. But I found that in reality, they had very, very little power, and they were working under the constant supervision of bureaucratic work teams who were stationed in the village. In terms of the outcomes of the new socialist countryside, they were very mixed. The campaign did lead to increased production and increased incomes. However, the production gains were not really strong enough to offset China's need for more food imports, and the gains in incomes were not really strong enough to narrow the rural-urban gap. And then finally, housing is an area that the campaign had a major impact on. It led to a complete transformation of the village environment with both positive and negative effects. So just to show you what I mean, here are two villages that underwent the New Socialist Countryside campaign. They're neighboring villages. So the one on the left-hand side of the screen had not yet implemented the New Socialist Countryside, and the one on the right had completed implementing the New Socialist Countryside. So these are neighboring villages. I just want to stress that again. And I'm sure if we went back today, the village on the left would look more like the village on the right. So through this campaign, the village environment was completely transformed. But was it a good thing? So here's another New Socialist Countryside that I visited in Hebei province. And the answer to whether or not it was a good thing is really depends on who you talk to in China. And I think that it's one of the tragic outcomes of the New Socialist Countryside that it initially started as this program to implement modest upgrades to the village environment, but then it kind of devolved into this campaign to move farmers into apartment style housing. And one reason for that is local governments were using the new socialist countryside and this village modernization program as an opportunity to steal farmers' land. Many people who were moved into these apartment buildings did so under duress, under extreme pressure. They had to take on household debts to do it because the government did not fully pay for it. Sometimes these houses were located really far away from their fields, so they had to give up farming, and these apartments were sometimes built in the countryside away from non-farming jobs. So people are kind of taking on this urban style of life, but they're not taking on new jobs to accompany it. The consolidation of rural housing started under the Hu Jintao administration with the new socialist countryside, and it's really only continued under Xi Jinping with his anti-poverty campaign. Okay, I just want to point out that I'm making an argument that campaigns mattered in East Asia, and it's an empirical argument, not a prescriptive one. I'm not arguing that other countries should copy what East Asia did, mostly because positive outcomes in the region are highly contingent. And what I mean by that is that they depend on a number of variables that don't usually go together. So the key explanatory variables, institutions and campaigns follow different logics, and they make different contributions to development. But campaigns really need institutions to succeed. They need effective local governments and farmers' organizations to be successful. I'm also saying that campaigns work better when there's centralized bureaucratic control and decentralized rural participation. Again, conditions that don't usually go together. And finally, I'm arguing that farmers' organizations are more effective if they possess both linkage and autonomy. Again, those things don't really go together. So the point is to say that these are the patterns I observed in East Asia, but I'm not sure there is an East Asian model that other developing countries could easily replicate. Then finally, I want to say something about the transition from urban bias, like the reasons why these countries reversed course and adopted pro-rural policies. In Taiwan and South Korea, elections really mattered. We're looking at the authoritarian period, but by the late 1960s, there were still elections under authoritarianism, and those elections indicated declining support for the incumbent in rural areas specifically. And these campaigns were launched to, the New Village Movement and the Community Development Campaign were launched in some ways to regain electoral support from farmers at a time of political transition. So that transition in Taiwan included the transition from Chiang Kai-shek's rule to his son Jiang Jingguo's rule. And then in South Korea, Park Chung-hee was trying to also modify the political system and make it essentially more authoritarian with this set of reforms called the Yushin reforms. Food security was also a concern because in the late 1960s and early 70s, the United States cut off food aid to Taiwan and South Korea. China food aid was not an issue, but by the late 1990s, food supply, food production, and so that also contributed to leaders thinking that they needed to adopt new policies. Migration goes along with food security. Increased numbers of migration from the countryside to the city meant that food security concerns were exacerbated as fewer and fewer people could produce food for the growing urban population. Also in South Korea's case, especially, migration was scary for Park Chung-hee because it contributed to the voter base, the number of disaffected voters in urban areas. Protest was a big deal in China in the late 90s, early 2000s. If you read that the literature on rural China at that time, the main theme is farmer dissatisfaction and rural protest. And then finally, I found that policy learning was really important because historically, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan all copied each other quite often. And one thing I also found is that China proactively looked to the experiences of South Korea in particular in formulating its own policies. So these are all the reasons I identified for this transition to pro-rural policies and the adoption of campaigns. So concluding thoughts, this will only take me like 2 minutes or 1 minute. Okay, so in terms of the broader implications of the study, the common use of campaigns in the region presents a challenge to the developmental state literature, which portrays East Asian governments as having a technical, rational approach to development. And then by showing that campaigns can succeed under certain conditions, the analysis also departs from theories of failed state-led development and failed intervention in the countryside. The study also challenges the Lewis model because it shows that rural development was really much more complex than the release of surplus labor, followed by the trickle-down benefits of industrialization. And finally, unlike the peasant politics literature, this is an older literature which focuses on resistance and informal institutions, the book shows that farmers or peasants can be actively involved in the development process through formal organizations with close ties to the state. And in that way, I'm building on the research of others who have stressed the importance of having strong organizations for development. But I'm also saying something about mobilized participation or state-induced participation, which China scholars tend to associate with Maoism. But what my study finds is that state mobilized participation was actually quite common throughout East Asia and central to the region's rural transformation for over a century. Okay, that is all. So now I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kristen.
Bravo.
I'm going to switch it over now to Mike, who will give our initial feedback.
Terrific. Congratulations, Kristen. I have 2 books. I encourage everyone to buy at least one. And I think in the chat function, it tells you how to buy one. I have the actual hard copy, which has one of the most beautiful covers for an international relations or comparative politics books I've ever seen. It's a kind of a, I'm sorry to be superficial and just focus on the cover at first, but it's a beautiful montage of the rural reform campaign posters from all 3 countries. But I also, in addition to that, have my ebook version, so I can search things digitally, which I've done because it's a really good resource. I first lived in East Asia and Japan in the countryside for 2 years. I've never told this to Professor Looney. I originally thought I would be a comparativist, but I ended up doing international relations and especially security policy. But that time in the countryside for me was critical in understanding state behavior at the system level. And I go back to rural Shizuoka every other year to kind of check in with my former friends and colleagues. I think this book is an incredibly important and successful contribution to our understanding of China, of East Asian development. As Professor Looney pointed out, the developmental state model and the other models tend to sort of ignore rural reform and the agricultural sector, which is absolutely critical for understanding the developmental model. She takes social mobilization as an independent variable and sets it against institutions so that we can understand it better. And I particularly like that because it brings agency back in, and especially agency for rural participants in the economy. And success is about empowering those participants. And that also makes it a very enjoyable read because these are colorful, interesting people in the fabric of their countries and their societies. And I think, although it's not a main feature of the book, I think it's particularly relevant right now because the focus on social mobilization is going to be a major feature of how we look at East Asia, especially China, going forward. In a different context, in a more contested and nationalistic context, but understanding social mobilization campaigns is really important. So I want to ask 2 questions, if I could. The first is focusing in on the independent variable that really animates your narrative, and that's social mobilization campaigns. And then the second is I want to rise in defense of the developmental state model. Half-hearted because in my dissertation many decades ago, I also argued against the developmental state model. So I'm with you in spirit, but I want to channel Chalmers Johnson and the developmental state model people I studied on Japan to see if maybe their model has more explanatory power than appears. So first on social mobilization, you mention a number of times in the book that these were Leninist governments.
Yeah.
Obviously the Chinese Communist Party, but so was the Kuomintang in Taiwan. And although you don't emphasize it as much, Pak Chung-hee, his first political participation was in the Communist Party.
Yeah.
And there was a heavy, so that's a real common denominator here, which is really interesting. So the question is, could you say a little bit more about it?
Yeah.
And also, retrospectively, because it seems to me today, post-democratization, that Leninist feature to social mobilization just doesn't matter as much in Korea or Taiwan, but it seems to me it matters even more in China. So say something about, if you could, about Leninism and social mobilization.
Yeah. So as my students who have taken Chinese politics with me know, the Soviets organized both the Chinese Communists and the Chinese Nationalists. They were both Leninist parties. And as research on the Kuomintang, specifically the Nationalist Party, has shown, that party only became more Leninist as it went to, after it went to Taiwan. And what I mean by that is the status of the party was elevated above the status of the state and above the status of the military. And mobilization was encouraged by Leninist regimes through under the guise of the party, right? Through kind of state-controlled organizations. And so instead of having a traditional autonomous civil society, what you have under Leninist regimes are mass organizations. And the farmers' associations in each of these countries can be viewed as a mass organization. And I think that even though we tend to group put the communist cases in one bucket and the non-communist cases in another bucket, they mimicked each other quite often from the 1920s onwards. And in their rivalry and in their competition, that mimicking was only exacerbated. So one of the interesting things, for example, about the New Village movement is that Park Chung-hee repeatedly called it a great leap forward. Where did he get that language? He must have gotten it from the Chinese case, from studying the Chinese case. He also may have been inspired by the Cholima movement in North Korea, which was a campaign similar to the Great Leap Forward. And so I kind of make the point in my writing that this idea that there were revolutionary regimes and kind of counter-revolutionary or right-wing authoritarian regimes misses those similarities that these regimes have. And that they all developed in the same kind of revolutionary context in the pre-war period. And therefore, in having been developed in the same context and being in competition with one another, had a high propensity for imitating one another in terms of the way that they approached social problems and the way that they tried to achieve economic development.
And do you I put out a proposition. Do you agree that today, to understand agrarian reform, rural politics in Korea and Taiwan, Leninism is just not as useful a perspective because of democratization? But in China, Leninism is much more important than perhaps people anticipated. And when you look at social mobilization today in Xi Jinping's China, or do you disagree?
I agree that democratization has transformed those farmers' associations into more independent interest groups that participate in democratic politics. But I also think that they have remained quite statist in all of those cases. They have very close ties to the state. They are partners with the state in terms of implementing policy, and that kind of sets them apart from other types of civil society because of that long history.
So it's sticky. The Leninism is pretty sticky. It sounds like.
I agree with that.
Yeah. So the other thing I wanted to ask, I agree with your takedown of the developmental state model, but let me try to defend it. And if I were someone from that school, I would say, you point out that the agrarian reform and the social mobilization campaigns occurred late in industrialization, which is not what a developmental state model would anticipate, because the technocrats would be doing this for good government. But one thing the developmental state model, Chalmers Johnson about Japan, for example, argues is actually that was part of the technocrats' plan. In order to have pro-business conservative parties stay in power, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan needed the countryside to be voting for them. And so in some ways, doesn't it make sense that as you had urbanization because of industrialization, technocrats and political leaders would have to do this to maintain a strong rural voting base for their industrialization? That's sort of the twist on it. And then I'll turn it over to Abe to MC.
So my two immediate responses that come to mind are, one, that I'm not saying the developmental state literature is wrong, just that it's incomplete. Because if you shift the focus from the industrial sector to the rural sector, you see a really different type of politics. That doesn't mean that Chalmers Johnson and everybody else's characterization of industrialization is incorrect. Just that we shouldn't assume that development in the countryside unfolded in the same way. But the second thing is that I think one way to understand campaigns, and going all the way back to for those of you who are familiar with Samuel Huntington's early work, It was about containing the green uprising, right? As kind of rural-urban inequality grows, and as a result of industrialization, and rural people become disaffected and they start mobilizing and organizing, regimes are faced with a choice. They can actually democratically empower these groups, or they can try to co-opt them and mobilize them within the system. So in order to kind of mobilize them within the system and prevent opposition parties from mobilizing them outside of the system to try to challenge the regime, I think this kind of mass mobilization campaign was a way of doing that, of creating buy-in and legitimacy from the rural population so that the existing power holders could hold on to their power, could maintain their power. And what's interesting is it's kind of a populist policy, even though when you look at who are the power holders in that society, it was a pretty conservative base. It was Park Chung-hee and other major industrialists. And farmers weren't empowered in the sense that they were given a seat at the policymaking table. Instead, they were just kind of activated by the state in order to carry out the state's vision of modernization. So I would say that these campaigns were a way of increasing rural populism and legitimacy so as to prevent an external threat to the regime, while also maintaining a very conservative governing coalition.
That's all for me, Professor Newman. Congratulations. This is going to be the Bible on understanding rural politics in Northeast Asia for a long, long time. And it's going to be, required reading for anyone looking at development more broadly. So thanks for including me. Back to you, Abe.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. So I wanted to, I'm going to ask a question, but while I'm doing that, I'd like to invite people to raise your hand so that you can get on the queue. We have about 15 more minutes. And so I'd like to, if there's questions from the audience, put those to Professor Looney. So Kristen, while we're getting those up, I wanted to ask, one reading of your book, I think is, this is a little complicated, but maybe Tocqueville in authoritarian countrysides. So my takeaway was, if you have these small autonomous kind of embedded groups, like there's an active political organization in the countryside, that's where you get the best results. And I was just kind of thinking of Tocqueville. I was thinking about Peter Evans' embedded autonomy, which is for the industrial, like the industrial side argument, but it's a very similar, or it resonates with that, the importance of civic communities and how they play a key role, even in authoritarian societies, to helping governments succeed. And so I just wonder if you could speak a little bit about that, about how authoritarian governments rely on civic communities, and what that might tell us about how authoritarian governments will evolve, or the dangers that they face when they squash those kinds of civic organizations. So, Tocqueville was like, you need those for democracy, but maybe you need those for autocracy as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. I like that frame. I wish I had heard that framing before the book. I would have included it.
Well, you can put it now in your talks, like you can, as the unfolding research agenda. That's what you always want to have. It's the unfolding research agenda.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
It's the bumper sticker.
A bumper sticker. Tocqueville, what is it? Authoritarian Tocqueville.
It was, yes, Tocqueville on the countryside, authoritarian Tocqueville on the countryside. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, absolutely. One of the big kind of conclusions of my work is that rural associational life is really, really important to achieving broad-based, extensive rural development, whether you're in a democracy or you're in an autocracy. And I think all of these authoritarian regimes, developmental states, knew that in order to achieve their economic goals, they had to penetrate society and penetrate the countryside. And so one of the first things that they did was to create state-controlled organizations in the countryside. That associational life, it's unusual, especially Taiwan's case was really unusual, how participatory and how democratic it was. But that unusualness can be explained by Taiwan's unique political circumstance. And what I mean by that is the KMT were outsiders to Taiwan, and their initial foray into the island was not good. It was a violent takeover, and there was not a lot of legitimacy that the KMT enjoyed in Taiwan. The KMT also really needed farmers to produce food because there were major food shortages in the countryside, and all of a sudden 2 million new residents of the island because of the Chinese Civil War. And the only way that they could, one, increase their popular legitimacy as outsiders in Taiwan, and two, actually spur agricultural development in a place where they didn't speak any local dialects, was to put local farmers, Taiwanese farmers, in charge of production. Because otherwise they were just completely incapable of achieving their economic goals for the countryside. And so I think what's really strange is Taiwan on the one hand has this like the longest history of martial law in world history. It did for a long time. I don't know if another country has surpassed it, but one of the longest periods of martial law in history. But on the other hand, during the entire martial law period, there were democratic elections. And those elections were very, for office, and those elections were very robust in the countryside. So yeah, Tocqueville in the countryside. I like that.
Great, thanks. So we have a few hands. We have 10 minutes left. So what I'm going to do is call on a few people, and then we'll get Kristen. We'll get your answers. So first, I have Liz.
Hi, Kristen. First of all, congratulations. This is such a great read and also fascinating work. I guess when I was doing field work for rural e-commerce in the countryside, I heard a lot of actually unsuccessful stories about targeted poverty alleviation, 精准扶贫. So right now I know why some of the campaigns do not work. So other than developmental state, which that angle, which Mike has pointed out, I think another very interesting angle I saw from your book, which I think also have external generalization possibility, is this interplay between campaign and institutions. In fact, I think it has answers that travels beyond rural development. For example, in the anti-corruption campaign, a major criticism against the anti-corruption campaign is that this kind of campaign, even though sometimes they work in the short run, but it also requires to destroy the existing institutions in some way. It's very radical, it is unexpected, and it is not sustainable. So one of the criticism against campaign style reform is that it has the effect of de-institutionalization. So I think when we think about the interplay between campaigns and institutions, not only they're substituting, but they could be mutually destructive in a way. So my question is, I wonder how you think about this question and whether in the rural countryside, we also saw these kind of like the negative effects that campaign brings to institutions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank
Kristen,
you so much.
Kristen, before we get, I just want to make sure that we get everybody.
Oh, sure.
Yes.
I can take more questions and then go back.
Yeah, Kelly Liu.
Hi, Professor Looney. Congratulations on your book. And this is a question from me and Sojang. We were curious about your methodology and your experiences doing fieldwork, and we just love to hear you talk a bit more about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly.
You're on, Kristen.
I'm on?
Yeah.
Okay. So in response to Liz's question first, yeah, I'm glad you think that the findings about campaigns and institutions and the relationship are generalizable beyond the book. Because one of my hopes is that in the China field, I refocus scholars' attention on the importance of mobilizational politics. I think there are a number of important studies that have talked about post-Mao campaigns, but I think that I'm really trying to add to that literature by also talking about this interplay between campaigns and institutions. I think institutions and campaigns can work together, but they can also be at odds. And as you pointed out with the anti-corruption campaign, the campaign has the effect of really undermining the credibility and people's faith in institutions. I think the Cultural Revolution, which I bring up only because I taught the Cultural Revolution to my graduate students yesterday, is an extreme example of how campaigns and institutions can work against each other, because that campaign completely destroyed the institutions of the state to the point, well, first of all, that was the goal of the campaign, but second of all, those institutions provided no check on the extreme violence and political and economic dysfunction that the campaign created. So I do think those things can definitely be in tension. But you know, But I'm also trying to kind of like, one of the overall goals of the book is to change people's way of thought, from thinking that campaigns are doomed to fail, that they always fail, because I don't think that that line of thinking is helpful for explaining their prominence in East Asia. Okay, well, if they fail all the time, why do these governments keep coming back to them time and again, right, for a century? They are at least somewhat efficacious, right? And I think that even the New Socialist Countryside and even Xi Jinping's anti-poverty campaign has been effective in many ways. And part of the reason for their effectiveness is because they're designed to go around institutions and to circumvent constraints to change, to get people involved in bringing about change and break them out of kind of cycles, their normal routines and cycles of doing things that contribute to bureaucratic inertia. And so I think that campaigns are effective, but yes, they can absolutely also undermine the credibility of institutions. It really just, I think, depends on the goals and how hard the central government is pushing those goals, whether one of the goals of the campaign is to transform institutions themselves, as was the case with the Cultural Revolution. And one way in which, I'm sorry for everyone on this call if like this discussion is too theoretical, but like one of the ways in which I think campaigns try to undermine or try to circumvent institutions is by bringing kind of new actors into politics, people who, you know, back to the whole emphasis on social mobilization. And that can be a really positive thing under many circumstances. The problem, of course, is that campaigns are plagued with vague, ambitious goals, and they create a really politicized environment where there's such high pressure on local officials to achieve those goals that sometimes they end up implementing to excess, right? And I think that that has happened in the New Socialist Countryside and many other campaigns in China. Thank you so much, Liz. And then as for Kelly and Sejong, I could talk like all day about my fieldwork experience, which is just like a fun thing for me to talk about. But to keep it short, I'll say that one of the fun things about my experience in studying China was when I went to the Jiangxi countryside, a local reporter dispatched an entire video team to follow me around for field work, and also decided to put my comings and goings kind of at the top of the newspaper website page. So all of a sudden there was just like so much local media attention on my presence, which was awful for like my ability to like have low-key interviews with people, right? And so there was some negotiation back and forth with the Ganzhou is the name of the city where I did a lot of work, with the Ganzhou propaganda department and the Gannan Daily News. And I finally got all these like reporters off of my back. And I was able to do research in a more kind of traditional research way, more low-key. But the benefit of having that media blitz at the beginning was that now all of these local officials in Ganzhou knew who I was. And I think the key to doing research in an authoritarian context like China is that you need to, you can't do it anonymously, especially if you look like me in the Chinese countryside. And it's a good thing for local officials to know who you are and to have the approval of the official department. So it took a very long time, and there were like certain trade-offs to get it, but I think in the end it was worthwhile, and if not entertaining. Yeah, I met tons of local officials.
Great. Thanks, Kristen. Thanks to everybody for joining us for this conversation. As you heard in the chat, you should buy now. Go to Cornell University Press, Amazon, buy now. There is, as it's popping up the chat, there's, I think, a discount code if you'd like to. And I just want to congratulate Kristen again. I want to thank Mike for the great comments, and for everybody for joining this conversation. If you will, hopefully we'll post this presentation on our website in a few weeks. So if you know anybody that missed it, please let them know that there'll be another opportunity to view it. Okay, thanks again. Thanks, Kristen.
Thank you so much to everybody for coming out. I really, 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 really appreciate it. Thank you.
Vanse, well done.